the civilizational question that Iran poses is unresolved with this conflict. I also think it makes Trump as a diplomatic operator less effective because people no longer believe him.
Combination of kind of partisan, anti-populist, anti-Trump, or just Western self-loathing reasons. People really liking the idea of these plucky Islamists dealing a decisive blow, not just to Trump, but to the West.
This is now a battle between two different constituencies, and that's what I think we'll see in the May elections. Professional class sitting beside the Greens and the working class sitting beside Reform.
We're spending half of the time talking about how this is a battle between hope in the form of the Green Party and hate in the form of Reform. Live, laugh, love version of progressivism, which is quite popular.
I'd say that seems to be the purpose, to make the Labour government feel like it's fighting anti-Semitism. It also shows that they can stop people coming to the country if they choose to.
Only ends up kind of feeding the very narrative that you're wanting to oppose, which is they will shut you up, they will crush you.
Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, delighted to be joined as ever by Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And thrilled to have one of our favourite returning guests, Spike columnist Luke Gittos.
Hi.
We've got loads to talk about today. We'll be discussing Reform versus the Greens in the local elections, the Iran ceasefire and the ban on Kanye West. But before we get into all that, we'd like to remind you about the Spiked Summit. Tom, tickets are selling well.
Yes, this is your weekly reminder about the Spiked Summit, which is our biggest event ever. It's happening on Saturday, the 27th of June at the Emmanuel Centre in Westminster. Tickets are selling very well, as Fraser says, but there's still some left. If you want to come along and see Konstantin Kissin, Lionel Shriver, Catherine Birbalsingh, Toby Young, Brendan O'Neill, as well as a bunch of other guests who we haven't announced yet, make sure you go to spiked-online.com/events to book your ticket. Also, if you're a Spike supporter, you get very healthy discounts. Do go over there and make sure you take advantage of that. Once again, the Spike Summit in June. Get your tickets on the website.
So it's coming up to the May elections. All of the UK parties have launched their campaigns. We've got local elections in England, elections to the Scottish and Welsh Parliament. And Reform have been pretty consistently topping the polls, but there have been some polls that have put the Green Party in second place. One Lord Ashcroft poll even put them in joint first. Sometimes it's the Conservatives in second. But Tom, I think, doesn't this suggest that we are in something of a new era where, for even if you discount the Greens, the era of the mainstream parties, of the Labour Tory duopoly is over?
No, absolutely. It's the twilight of the uniparty is the story of our time, and certainly the story of these local elections, if these polls are going to hold up. I mean, usually a local election is a kind of a midterm. It's a kind of temperature check on the popularity of the serving government and the relative strength of the opposition. But as you suggest, it's a quite unique story of a supposed third party in the form of Reform topping the polls pretty consistently, and the Green Party, another challenger party, this one on the left, battling it out for second place. I mean, it's only not unprecedented in the sense that we had the local elections last year where Reform made tremendous gains, but it does show that we're in an entirely new political era. And the question is just how bad it's going to be for Labour and the Conservatives, respectively. I mean, there was one projection which had Labour losing 2,000 seats, the Conservatives losing 1,000, Reform picking up north of 2,000 themselves, and the Greens gaining something like 500. So it's really unique set of circumstances. I'm sure we'll go into the specifics of some of the different localities and nations and how that's going to play out. But yeah, the old politics is over, certainly, and under sustained challenge in a way that we haven't seen for a century.
And Luke, I mean, this is the big story, is really the dying of the old parties. Obviously, the Conservatives were shattered after 14 years in government, but the speed with which the Labour Party has, fallen out of favour with the public is astonishing, and perhaps surprised even those of us who already knew Keir Starmer wasn't up to much before he got into power.
Yeah, I think the exciting thing about Reform is the constituency that sits behind them. They are taking advantage of a groundswell of working class support amongst those in sort of manual labour, working jobs, what you might call working class voters. The Greens are taking advantage more of the kind of graduate level professional class. So there is these kind of two constituencies that sit behind them. And I think Reform do have the momentum because I think they're tapping into that constituency that voted Leave and believed in Britain succeeding in Brexit. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of the remnants of that constituency still pushing for the kind of change that Brexit promised to represent. And Brexit was about sending a message to the political class about ripping up old ways of governing. The key message of Brexit was that we want to be governed in our name and not in the name of foreign bureaucrats sitting in Brussels. That was a really positive message about sovereignty, about democracy. And that constituency, I think, is still there. And that's what sits behind reform. On the Green side, it's a very different offering. It's a middle-class, disillusioned bourgeoisie who are looking at Keir Starmer's Labour Party and thinking they're not radical on things like net zero and on Gaza. And I think if you're going to choose between those two constituencies, I'd much rather the former. And that's why reform is a more exciting prospect. Reform, it's worth also pointing out that they are being tested at the moment in local government. So there's been some reporting around their activities in the council seats that they've won. There's mixed messages coming out there on, their competence, to be frank, and on their ability to carry forth some of their promises, for example, on reducing council tax. A lot of arguments saying that they haven't carried through on their promises at the local level. So it'll be interesting to see if they do get the kind of success that some are anticipating, whether they can follow through at the local level. But similarly for the Greens, they will face a similar questions if they make gains of their own. But this is now a battle between two different constituencies, and that's what I think we'll see in the May elections: the kind of professional class sitting beside the Greens and the working class sitting beside Reform, and that's the kind of ideological battle that will take place, I think.
And a lot of people have sort of been talking about this graph that shows the differences in education levels, with the Greens attracting mostly well-educated people, quote unquote, and Reform attracting less educated people. That's obviously being used to sneer at people who don't have a degree, but you would think that, if you compared, there might be plenty of reform policies that we disagree with, but it's a paragon of sanity compared with, the Green clown show, let's be honest.
And I think that, paired with the fact that the Labour Party are now the party of the privately educated, suggests that if we're going to remove the vote from anyone, it should be the highly educated, until we work out what the hell is going on. But yeah, the sneering is always there when you see statistics like that. But it's interesting the extent to which the left, whether we're talking about Labour or the Greens, have kind of tacitly accepted that they've lost what they would like to think of as their historic constituency. I mean, the Labour Party still have a kind of rhetorical or nostalgic attachment to the working class, but everything that they do clearly doesn't appeal to them whatsoever. And in the form of the Green Party, I think you've got a much more kind of explicit play towards not just the kind of disaffected bourgeois vote as well, but also this new kind of sectarian voting, leaning in within the inner cities to the issue of Gaza as a kind of way into to trying to gin up a sense of Muslim identitarian grievance, trying to repeat the trick of the Gorton-Denton by-election, essentially. And you saw that laid out perfectly in the local elections campaign pitch that Zach Polanski made today, on the day that we're recording, where he's spending half of the time talking about how this is a battle between hope in the form of the Green Party and hate in the form of Reform, kind of certainly appealing to that pretty thin, sloganistic sort of live, laugh, love version of progressivism, which is quite popular amongst the kind of downwardly mobile middle class. But also talking about Israel and talking about Gaza as if that had anything to do with a local election campaign. But we know from the campaigns that we've seen fought in various mayoralties or in the general election, as well as some local elections as well, in inner cities, diverse areas, where that is very much weaponized. The issues of bin collections taking a distant second or third place to the issue of what's going on with Israel and Gaza. So you're seeing that play out. And it's another reminder, really, that for all of the talk about division and hatred, which is projected onto Reform, there's only really one force in politics which is explicitly trying to carve up voters along these lines, and is doing so on a kind of mainstream level, and that is the Green Party. And they're doing so incredibly shamelessly at this point.
We should talk a bit about some of the Green policies, because they've been coming in for a lot of flack. They've announced a few things like rent controls, which, one of those things that sounds nice, but has failed everywhere it's been tried, leads to higher rent, makes it harder to find a house because people just take their properties off the market if they can't get the market rate they want. There's 55 miles per hour motorways, obviously a nod to the fact that probably no one in the Green Party owns a car. And a lot of people have been pouring online. There's a lot of viral discussion on X about the Greens' migration policies, which, this is actually not even a Zach Polanski policy, but predates his leadership. But it's still part of the sort of party policy playbook, where not only will you have open borders, literally any person can get a visa. You get a visa, you can apply for a visa on entry. You can become a resident within 3 months. You'll be entitled to a universal basic income, not just the usual benefits that normal British people are entitled to at the moment.
Treating migrants as citizens as well.
Citizens have the right to vote. There were no deportations. I mean, even if you think a liberal immigration policy is the right way to go, surely this is just beyond insane. And again, it does seem like the reform position is, even if you think it's too authoritarian or restrictive or whatever, it's clearly the more sensible option. This is not in the madhouse.
Yeah, well, just taking it back to the university level education issue, the Greens' policies are effectively lifted from university humanities departments. It exists in that on that level. It doesn't make any real connection with the British public. Most of the people that are sitting behind reform are pushing for stronger immigration controls. They want to see a return of controls to our border, and I would be aghast if that kind of migration policy had any play with the British public. It's worth remembering Zach Polanski's been on a big push to kind of justify his position and to spell out his policy in more detail. He did that big spread over last weekend where he set out some of his policies, and number one was a wealth tax. This is the kind of thing that is not going to. They have very little vision for growth in the British economy. They are about the politics of the university campus. And you can even see that in the way that they are campaigning with those unwatchable videos of Zach Polanski and dancing at festivals and basically campaigning on the level of vibes. That's how they're operating. And I think when you look at some of the madder elements of what they are putting forward and what they are arguing for, some of it gets genuinely scary. Like in energy policy, for example, the idea that you are running net zero carbon cutting, an experiment, a real middle class experiment with people's lives and living costs at a time where our energy markets are so vulnerable and our energy supply is so vulnerable. That's when their policies actually really get frightening, when you think that they are living out a middle class experiment at the risk of everyone's livelihood.
And it is worth stressing that the Green Party policy is not just against oil and gas, which is suicidal and crazy enough. They're also opposed to nuclear energy. So, really they're talking about 100% reliance on wind and solar. It's basically, it might as well just come out and say we want to abolish electricity. That is essentially their view of the world. It's completely insane. And yet, as we've been saying, why it's the educated people that go for this.
Yeah, and they're explicitly against it. It says the party now of no energy, no growth and no borders. They explicitly say that in that migration policy. In an ideal world, we are against borders, but pragmatically, we have to put a few measures in place.
And no biological sex as well.
That's true.
That's the other one.
Exactly. So throw all of the kind of building blocks of the sane society out. It's interesting that how quickly we end up having a conversation about questions of sort of national policy, even in the terms of local election. But I think that's quite natural. It's clearly part and parcel of the broader political debate in a way that local elections might not have been previously. And I do wonder at what point the kind of extremism, frankly, of the Green Party in a lot of these questions is going to catch up with them. Because if you take an issue like mass migration, there's a tendency to talk about it as if it's like a 50-50 issue or a 52-48 issue. It's more like a 75-25 issue in terms of firm public opposition to it. When Shabana Mahmood, the Labour Home Secretary, unveiled her various immigration reforms, which gave many people in the Labour Party and certainly the Green Party all kinds of conniptions, when More in Common polled them, they found that, first of all, 7 in 10 Labour voters supported them, as well as almost half of Green voters supported them. So I do wonder at what point, when the gushing media portrayals give way to genuine scrutiny of Polanski, his party and his policies, whether or not that will start to catch up with them around the edges. And also whether or not the kind of unlikely coalition that he's carving out between sort of 20 or 30 something graphic designers and Islamic sectarians starts to break down, which already and all starts to come into tension, which you're already starting to see signs of. We haven't spoken yet about Birmingham, but that's one that people should definitely watch as far as the council elections there. There's this whole slate of independent candidates which have been put together, which is essentially a kind of mix of primarily kind of Islamic sectarian independents and a few Workers' Party candidates as well. It's kind of a distinction without a difference in many respects. That they're projected to potentially, with the Greens, get somewhere close to a majority. So all of these things are really right to play out. And you kind of see the story of our politics as far as you have the kind of unfinished business of Brexit, the realignment that brought, the reassertion of the working class and their interests in our politics. as well as the kind of backlash from the professional managerial class, and also this new sectarianism, which has been bubbling under the surface for some time, but has only now burst out into the open. So yeah, the words fascinating and local elections have not always coexisted in the sentence, but they certainly do these days.
And Luke, is there anything you want to add before we move on?
I was going to talk about the motion that was being debated by the Green Party to proclaim that Zionism is racism. There was a very interesting debate at the Green Party level around that motion. People saying, even within the Green Party, saying the wording of this is slightly extreme, i.e. we want one single Palestinian state from the river to the sea. Really frightening stuff that did cause some nervousness, even among mainstream Green Party members. But it just illustrates this clear sectarian dividing line that the Greens sit in, and which they've encouraged and which they've fomented amongst their own ranks. They are now sitting side to side with some very, very radical Islamist tendencies that I think we will only see more of in the as they start to campaign both locally and nationally.
So at the time you're watching this, things may have moved on a bit. It's a very fast-moving story, but there is currently a ceasefire in place between the US and Iran. Having tweeted that he was going to, a civilization will die tonight, and it leveled all kinds of threats at the Iranians. Trump eventually announced a deal that there would be a 2-week pause in the fighting. Now, there's some contesting that. There's a lot of the US say that this doesn't include the Israel-Hezbollah war. The Iranians say it should have included that, and they're upset that that's going on. But it is, Tom, what have you made of this? I mean, it's obviously good to see some pause in the hostilities. Good that Trump didn't carry out his apocalyptic threats, even though it might not have been likely in the first place, and he was probably bluffing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there was a huge level of hysteria, frankly, in relation to those comments. The idea that he was going to wipe a civilization off the map was clearly never on the cards. I mean, there was even when J.D. Vance just in passing talked about if, the Iranians didn't play ball, that America would, use means that it hadn't done before. That was instantly written up as he was talking about nuclear weapons. I mean, of all the people who was going to kind of engage in nuclear saber rattling, it's not going to be firmly anti-war J.D. Vance, but such was the climate that was easily talked about. And this ceasefire may well have unraveled by the time people listen to or watch this, for the reasons that you suggest. It's already looking quite shaky. Obviously, Donald Trump putting a lot of emphasis on them reopening the Strait of Hormuz. That doesn't seem to have happened. There's even talks of Iran operating some kind of toll system, and it's still operating at a bit of a trickle. Israel have shown no indication and no inclination to stop their attempts to clear Hezbollah out of southern Lebanon, and it's unclear that anything would change to make them rethink that particular position. And also all of the kind of contradictions in what we've been told. The fact that there is this 10-point peace plan that the Iranians put forward, which was presented by the Americans as a starting point for negotiations, and yet it's full of non-starters as far as the US's war aims are concerned, saying that Iran should maintain the ability to enrich uranium, that it should basically firm up its control over the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, all of this is not going to happen, frankly. So it's a very uneasy, temporary piece. But the discussion of it is probably worth unpicking a little bit, because there has been almost a gleeful tendency to just declare the fact that the Americans have been humbled by the Iranians in this situation. And of course, one can make the argument that all the Islamic Republic has to do is survive this war in order to win on some level, even though that does seem to completely ignore how heavily both their leadership and their ability to menace their neighbours has been degraded, if not completely destroyed in the midst of this conflict. But I think there is an element, and Brendan made the point on the site, of kind of wishful thinking, for a combination of kind of partisan, anti-populist, anti-Trump, or just Western self-loathing reasons, people really liking the idea of these plucky Islamists dealing a decisive blow, not just to Trump, but to the West. And I think that's something that is worth working out, how people have got themselves into that corner, even if, as we've raised various criticisms of this war, how it's been prosecuted, the slightly unclear, or in some cases overly optimistic aims that were vested in it from the off. Now that it's begun, to hope that it goes essentially against the West is a strange position to find yourself in, but it's one that many people have. certainly over the course of the past couple of weeks.
Yeah, it feels like there's such a big difference between, perhaps the US not meeting its war aims, or the problems that there are with the Strait of Hormuz and the global chaos that that's causing, with what people are saying is this is worse than Vietnam. This is a Suez moment for the United States. And it does just feel, as you say, Tom, a bit like anti-Trumpist wishful thinking rather than an assessment of what's going on the ground. Because, we've been critical of the war. We've been critical of the anti-war side as well for basically not realizing the problem with Iran. Too many people are a little bit too sympathetic to the other side, rather than being more sober kind of critics of the war.
Yeah, I think I've found it depressing, as many people have, that the Islamic regime have proven far more resilient than we might have expected, and certainly that Trump expected. He came out announcing that this was a historic moment for the Iranian people to rise up, take their country back, etc. I think he clearly underestimated how well the regime would be able to control, for example, the international trade and hold the world to ransom. I mean, they have been successful in doing that. So it is worth pointing that out. But you're right to say that there is a sort of gleefulness about it. And the civilizational question that Iran poses is unresolved with this conflict. And we still are in a situation where we have an Islamist regime threatening the entire West. They will carry on their war with Israel and the West through their proxies and elsewhere. And that is a problem that is not going away with this ceasefire. I mean, as you say, the idea that the IRGC will effectively control the Strait of Hormuz and therefore have a veto over world trade is completely mad and is unsustainable. They would effectively be using proceeds from international shipping to fund an ongoing war against the West. Yeah. It's just totally unsustainable. And so the situation is unresolved. I think what we have learned, as has been hinted at, is that there is now absolutely no connection between what Trump says over Truth Social and what is happening in the background of his war room and among the generals, Pete Hegseth and others. Those are two very, very different realities. And to some extent, that level of diplomacy has been successful in the past. His Brinkman, and that it's unknown. I just don't know whether his tweet about ending Iranian civilization was the deciding factor here. I doubt that it was. But I do think even in order for his model of diplomacy to be successful, i.e. he is kind of, he does operate slightly in this bully boy way of saying very, very aggressive things in the hope that people come to the table. Those threats need to at least be realistic in order to be effective. Because if he does continue with this, frankly, what looks like to be totally overblown level of threat, then people will simply stop believing him. Yeah. And, So I don't think we should normalize a president, the leader of the free world, suggesting that he was going to end a civilization overnight. I also think it makes Trump as a diplomatic operator less effective because people no longer believe him. But the war has left a civilizational question unresolved. What to do about the regime in Iran, how to eventually win this war, because I think we do need to win it. And when I say we, I mean the West in broad terms. And how do we bring about an end to the situation where Israel is locked in a decades-long war with Iran and its proxies? That has to come to an end. And how that happens is no clearer now than it was at the start of this war.
And that decades-long point is really crucial because, yes, this particular phase began, on the 28th of February, but Iran has been waging war against Israel and against the West for a lot longer than that. Not just even, October 7th, which was carried out by Iranian proxies that, brought about this most violent aspect of it. But really, since its founding, it's as the Islamic Republic is constitutionally committed to, at the very least, the destruction of Israel, if not the opposition to the entire West. That's, as you say, is a civilizational problem.
Yeah, and has this apocalyptic ideology and this apocalyptic mission, which is not often very well understood, I suppose, in kind of Western commentary. Of course, there's going to be sections of the regime which are going to be more pragmatic, less zealous, less Islamist in their kind of intent and their day-to-day running of things. But nevertheless, that's a core part of that regime, which is blithely kind of papered over. Meanwhile, everything that Trump says on Truth Social, trying to kind of play a slightly cartoonish version of the madman theory of geopolitics, is taken completely literally and sort of seriously. And I think that disjoint is very strange. And also the talk about, this is kind of genocidal rhetoric. Meanwhile, the genocidal actions of the Iranian regime and its proxies in relation to Israel are just, again, kind of hushed over, is very, very striking. I suppose we should talk briefly a little bit about Keir Starmer as well, who has become a bit more of a story, but only really as a figure of mockery in recent days as well.
He's been in the Gulf, taking credit for the ceasefire.
As soon as the war was over, he was straight there. Or as soon as the ceasefire was declared, I should say, he was straight there. It was kind of trying to take credit for...
Should say his trip was actually planned before the ceasefire, but
they were holding off on doing it until it was actually declared. And trying to kind of take credit and trying to assert himself as a key figure in securing the safe passage of freight through the Strait of Hormuz going forward. I mean, a lot of people made this joke, but it did have sort of shades of sort of John Terry rushing onto the pitch at the 2012 Champions League final, despite being suspended from the game, but in his full Chelsea kit and shin pads in order to take some sort of glory for it. That actually doesn't really hold up, because at least John Terry had something to do with that particular successful campaign, whereas Keir Starmer has been a complete spectator to this entire conflict so far. The fact that he's now suggesting that the United Kingdom could be a significant player in ensuring the clear passage of trade, despite the fact that when this war kicked off, it took us 3 weeks to get one destroyer over to the Middle East, and it's currently docked because it's got water supply issues. It's sort of become a kind of running joke / metaphor for the weakness of our own armed services in relation to this conflict. And it's just shown what how structurally kind of weakened we've become over many decades, which is something that Keir Starmer can't have the blame laid at his door for, but also how him as a kind of uniquely kind of prevaricating, legalistic, bureaucratic figure has just made that so much worse. There's obviously various powers throughout Europe who have been quick to say that this is not our war and we don't want anything to do with it, and so on and so forth. But I think Keir Starmer has been singled out quite naturally because of the fact that even if you're going to try and oppose what is going on, you can at least do it from something like a position of strength. And yet what we've had from him is kind of prevarication, at one, originally wanting to allow the Americans to use RAF bases, at least for defensive measures, but not, again, hesitating because he couldn't get it past Ed Miliband, famously, reportedly, allegedly saying to Trump that he needed to talk to his team before he made a decision on anything. I think shows what a uniquely kind of weak and indecisive figure that he's cut in relation to this conflict, and that he's now just left, as has happened with many international conflicts, I think it's fair to say, Ukraine, the quote-unquote coalition, the willing being a useful parallel, just kind of play acting at statesmanship, sort of play acting as a figure on the world stage, meanwhile having absolutely nothing to back it up, which again is not all of his fault, but he's a useful foil and kind of metaphor for just how weak and indecisive we've become in these questions.
I mean, we should say it's partly his fault in that he is not a politician. I mean, he is a lawyer. And actually, in the days after this war began, the Labour front bench were on the media rounds saying this was an illegal war.
Yeah.
And that was the line. And it didn't really change. No lawful basis was what minister after minister was saying. No lawful basis, no lawful basis. And what Keir Starmer was saying, there's no lawful basis to this war. But as Tom says, it's perfectly reasonable to say that there is no lawful basis for this war. I mean, there's not a lawful basis for many wars. But, you can make that argument. But you have to then say, morally, this is where we stand on this conflict. This is where we stand on questions of Iran and its relationship with Israel. And Keir Starmer, I don't think he thinks very seriously politically through these issues. And when he says he talks to his team, I mean, he's talking to a team of lawyers. He's talking to people like Richard Hermer and others. And most of his government front bench who are legalistically minded, they see what the law says as the final word on many of these fundamentally political questions. And so next time there is a big question of international politics, listen to the Labour front bench. They will say what the law says, what the courts say, and their actual political conviction will be an afterthought if it's there at all.
I mean, there was an interesting sort of parallel last year. I don't know if you remember, in the very last moments, the government had to save British steel from being forcibly sabotaged, essentially, by the Chinese. And the business secretary, Johnny Reynolds, came up with this plan to stop it. And Keir Starmer says, well, what does the law say? And, Jonathan Reynolds had to say, no, you make the law. You are the Prime Minister. We will legislate to stop to make this happening.
And this is interesting as well, and you'll be able to speak to this, Luke, I'm sure. But the constant talk about international law in relation to conflicts often feels like a kind of somewhere between a kind of fiction and a piety most of the time. The realities of hard power often continue to win out, even supposedly in the great era of the rules-based international order, which seems to be drawing to a close. All that being said, I think where Starmer is concerned, there's also the extent to which it just becomes a substitute for thinking, for having judgment. What do we do about this conflict? What do we do about this overseas territory to which there's a claim to? You just defer to what the lawyers are telling you. You defer to some judgment that's been made by an international court. It becomes a way to get out of trying to work out what is in your own national interest, what is strategically important and sensible. You just can delegate that to some other force. And I wonder if Keir Starmer is a good example of that. He can't think for himself, and therefore he can just appeal to the authority of other institutions, legalistic institutions, in order to have some kind of position on these conflicts.
Yeah, and it's just worth finessing with what you said, Fraser, which was, he says you are the one that makes the law. But of course, in many cases, he's not, because he's talking about international law, which often is not made by us, or not drafted by us. It might be adopted by us in domestic law, but it's something that isn't part of our. The Prime Minister doesn't get to say what's in the Geneva Convention or the UN conventions or the European Convention on Human Rights. These are something that they're kind of passively absorbed into our legal system through our own legislation. So he's often, and it goes across questions like questions of immigration, questions of asylum. All of their responses to these issues are, what does the law say? What do the courts say? And that really holds us in a kind of stasis on adapting to contemporary conditions.
So let's talk about Kanye West, or Ye, as we should probably call him now. He has been banned from the UK. He was due to perform at Wireless Festival in London this summer for headlining it for 3 nights. But because he's the headline act, the whole festival has now been cancelled. It's no secret as to why he's banned, although the government line on these things, the official Home Office line is always that so-and-so is not conducive to the public good. We know it's because of his anti-Semitic comments, songs, memorabilia, the whole gamut. Tom, what have you made of this? You're disappointed as a punter as much as anything else.
Exactly.
I'm sure.
That's the main issue. That's the main issue that we need to discuss all of this. But no, I mean, the whole Kanye West, the Nazification of Kanye West is fascinating. As far as what if one of the biggest stars in the world, arguably the most significant pop cultural figure of his generation of the 21st century, went around saying, "I am a Nazi," went around making songs called Heil Hitler, went around selling T-shirts with swastikas on them. I mean, and that has just been playing out across, various cancellation campaigns, various attempts to debank him, and various attempts to ban him from playing in different countries. And of course, in the context of rising anti-Semitism, not just in this country, but we've got a particular problem that we're faced with. You can totally understand the deep concern that would exist to someone like that coming to North London to play for 3 nights in front of thousands and thousands and thousands of people. He's obviously been on this apology tour recently, taking out a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal saying that he was just in the grips of one of his manic episodes, that he wanted to apologise, and he's since said that he wanted to meet with the British Jewish community to try and make amends. He did say similar things back in 2023 and then put out that Heil Hitler song 2 years later. So you can understand why people aren't necessarily willing to take him at his word on all of this. But we can get into the sort of the unique psychology of the man if we want to, but it also sort of comes down to what purpose does this serve, and will it be effective? And it's not clear on either front. I mean, first of all, if you're going around just sort of banning artists from performing in your country on the basis of horrendous things they've said, that's going to quickly become a very, very long list, even though he's the most sort of extreme example that we're talking about. And it's just, particularly in an era in which he's still on all the streaming services, in which even those songs which were deleted from the streaming services because they were quite so extreme are readily available, just the utility of any of this doesn't make any sense. So it does necessarily become a kind of corrosion of free expression to a certain extent, and people's ability to go see someone perform if they choose to. And I think it is fair to say that unlike a kind of Bob Villain or whatever, the vast majority of people, the vast majority of people who would be going to see Kanye West would not be because they endorse his horrific, extreme rantings and views. It's because they actually like his
much larger back catalogue than that. Yeah.
anything. If he went into one of his rants, I think they would sigh, because I think actually you want to hear the music rather than the politics, such as it is. But yeah, what purpose does it serve? It's not immediately obvious. And also, I think there's the extent to which it just becomes sort of symbolic, and you could say that's useful in a sense. Obviously, there's been various Jewish organisations which have been calling for this, would feel neglected if such a light touch was given to a figure like Kanye West. Meanwhile, you can get cancelled and even blocked from coming to the country for saying a hell of a lot less, if we're being perfectly frank. If you look at the list of people who have had visas removed of late, at the same time, it becomes a little bit like a sort of displacement activity. The Labour government being seemingly either unwilling or unable to tackle where anti-Semitism is genuinely coming from in this country, which seems to be a kind of heady mixture of sort of Islamist, Muslim sectarianism, as well as a smattering of kind of progressive, useful idiot anti-Semitism as well. So therefore, it just engages in this sort of grandstanding over a huge pop cultural figure, whilst leaving the more crucial problem in terms of the day-to-day lives of Jewish people in this country untouched.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that seems to be the purpose, to make the Labour government feel like it's fighting anti-Semitism when it isn't. It also shows that they can stop people coming to the country if they choose to. Luke, what have you made of it?
Yeah, I mean, I was a Kanye fan. I think his back catalogue was an inspiring body of work, and I think what's happened to him, I can almost believe his account of this in terms of mental health and mental illness, almost. But having said all of that, when I heard him headlining a festival almost out of nowhere, having released a song, as you say, calling Heil Hitler 2 years ago, and given the climate that we live in at the moment around anti-Semitism, I was nervous about it. I was nervous about him appearing at a festival and the spectacle of hundreds of thousands of people going to see him. That as a spectacle made me nervous, and especially given the stuff we've seen at Glastonbury with Bob Dylan and the chanting of death to the IDF. We do live in a culture where anti-Semitism is just simmering, and I think but having said all of that, banning him is not the answer, and you can't use the law, and especially immigration law, to effectively censor people. So I think this is a mistake. There was also some real questions around the timeline of this, like had he been issued with a visa and then was there fuss about it and they revoked it? And it wasn't exactly clear what decision had been made when. I think ultimately the decision to ban him is the wrong one. I think the decision to put him as a headline act was the wrong one at this particular moment, at this particular time. I think Wireless made a mistake in doing that. It just didn't see it. The whole debate came a little bit out of nowhere, suggesting that perhaps Wireless hadn't even thought that it would be controversial to put him on a headline slot like this. So I think there's a lot of play here. Ultimately, revoking his visa was the wrong thing to do, because that's fundamentally the government taking a censorious position, which we don't want. But I think we need to understand, putting him as a headline act at a major festival made me feel a little bit nervous, and I don't think I was alone in that. I also, and of course it goes without saying that the grandstanding from the Labour front bench around anti-Semitism, he is an easy target for them. Because he is so warped, his position has been so open and so explicit. He's an easy target for their for their legislation and for their steps and their measures, whilst letting anti-Semitism be openly flaunted on the streets of London every week at the pro-Palestinian demos. The Labour front bench has singularly failed to take anti-Semitism seriously in any area of public life where it exhibits itself, and so to identify this on the point on which they're going to make a grandstand, I agree, is hypocritical.
Yeah, and there have been great artists in the past who've sort of dabbled in this kind of Nazi chic in a way. David Bowie famously said, the UK needs a spell of fascism. Sex Pistols would dance around with swastikas. I know the context.
I read this, I didn't know this, but Keith Moon, the drummer from The Who, drove around Golders Green in an SS uniform in an open-top car. I didn't realise that. So there's a long, not to say that this excuses any of this behaviour, of course, but there's an interesting history.
And there's a clear element of provocation as well, which you're never quite sure what side of the line Kanye West is on that. Is he, is he saying this because it's the one thing you're not allowed to say, or well, it's one of the many things. It's the worst possible thing you can say, and as someone transgressive, he's going to damn well say it. So there's that aspect of it as well, because you could say that he's a product of cancel culture, and in fact, every attempt to cancel him has resulted in an even worse manifestation of this kind of weird Nazi stuff.
And it seems where Kanye is concerned, to the extent that you can sort of trace it back, it seems to be a bit of column A and a bit of column B. There's reports of sort of lines from songs excised many, many years ago, which seem to indulge in certain anti-Semitic tropes. He has a long-standing relationship with Louis Farrakhan, head of the Nation of Islam, a despicable anti-Semitic organization, which still has some kind of level of cultural cred in kind of African American and rap culture, remarkably, even now. But also there's quite clearly, whether it's bipolar or autism, he has various different different accounts of that, shall we say, and claims that he's been misdiagnosed. It's clearly a part of the picture as well. Seems to be engaged in kind of years-long manic episodes at various points, which has fed this kind of behaviour. But I think particularly when you're talking about a mind which was obviously given to paranoia as well as prejudice, and also the particularly kind of conspiratorial nature of anti-Semitism, which is one of the things that distinguishes it from other forms of racism, just quite how potently conspiratorial it is. You can't help but feel that the efforts to understandably make a clamp down upon it as a means to making a stand only ends up kind of feeding the very narrative that you're wanting to oppose, which is they will shut you up, they will crush you, they will make sure that your free speech is taken away. But you do, like, as you say, Fraser, you do, for however he's ended up there, it's almost like this is just the most extreme provocation he can do, and also a sense in which, because he was so rich and so powerful, could he get away with it? Could he even say this? That seems to have been part of the psychology driving him to this, pretty grim and sort of nihilistic place that he's ended up.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Luke. Thank you to everyone watching at home. But that's not all. If you're a Spike supporter, you can join us over on Spike Podcast Unlocked, where we'll be discussing whether human rights will bring down the West and whether youth clubs can solve knife crime. See you there.
The right to asylum that we currently hold in this country would apply to about 48 million people worldwide. Right? So it's like, it is a legal fiction.
Thank you so much for watching the Spike Podcast. We'll be back next week, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the Spike Podcast, then why not check out what else our channel has to offer, from our documentaries to our weekly interviews and podcasts like The Brendan O'Neill Show. And if you're a Spike supporter, you can watch the second half of this episode by logging in on the Spike website. If you're not yet a Spike supporter, then why not sign up now? You'll get unlimited access to the website, ad-free reading, discounted tickets to our events, and so much more. So become a Spike supporter today by going to spiked-online.com/support. That's spiked-online.com/support.